Okay, so this is if the control the force lectures in some ways are kind of my conceptually favorite things that we do in class. The physiology of resistance training is got to be kind of a close second in a lot of ways, and I think it's something that you guys will find really, really interesting. And my hope is that most of the stuff that I'm going to cover or that we're going to start to cover today is very much things that you guys have seen before. You should have seen it in health and fitness. If you've taken personal training, if you've taken advanced strength and conditioning, you should have seen some of it in there. And this is also stuff where there's a lot of stuff out in the popular press and those kinds of things. And so we're gonna get into a little bit of if you're gonna go resistance train today, okay, then what should you actually do? What's the thing that goes on when you're doing squats or bench press or curls or whatever it is? Like, what's the stuff that is happening inside the muscle and in the nervous system that's going to actually trigger and drive those adaptations to make muscles bigger, to make muscles stronger. Okay. And then we'll get into a little bit with sort of what's the stimulus, but then what is it that actually changes, right? What happens at the level of the sarcomere or the proteins or the muscle fiber? What happens in the brain and the neuromuscular system that's going to change and adapt, and how do all of those things work together to lead to these adaptations to resistance training that most people when they go and they do resistance, that's what they're after. Okay. So what we will kind of do is we'll start with the big picture first, and I'll kind of tell you guys the end game at the very, very start. Like, this is what we know, this is what we think happens, right? This is how much bigger, how much stronger you're going to get. This is what the actual stimulus is and why we train the way we train. And then we'll kind of dig in sort of piece by piece by piece as we go along after all of that. Okay. So usually if we were in class, I'd be like, okay, tell me about your roommate. Maybe for you guys, if you're there and if you have a roommate or something and they're just like hanging around, you can yell at them and ask them like, hey, why would you resistance train or something. But the general sense, right? And most of you guys, I think, probably have a good idea on these things, that the vast majority of people, when they perform resistance training, they are attempting or hoping to get some adaptations that are going to take place. And those are primarily going to be related for kind of non-athletes, that they want their muscles to be stronger and they want their muscles to be bigger, right? They want a bigger size of their muscle. We're going to call that hypertrophy. I know you guys have heard that term before. But if we went to the gym today, right, you guys go to Steel today, which I'm sure some of you guys go to Steel. You find the steroid bros that have probably already been there for 2 hours doing things today. And you ask them, like, why are you training today, bro? And they're going to come back with one of these two things. I want to be bigger. I want to be stronger. Okay. And those are absolutely two things that will happen when you resistance train for a majority of people in a majority of circumstances. Okay. The other piece, though, that is actually really important for people that are athletes in some ways, but also for regular everyday folks that are maybe on kind of the lower end of physical function, is that this increase in strength, especially, is going to potentially improve your ability to perform. And so we traditionally think of performance as I can bench more, I can squat more, I can power clean more, therefore I can run faster, jump higher, right? I can knock the guy over if I'm playing football, I can do something in basketball, whatever that's going to be. But it's also really, really important to think of physical performance if you are, and I'll just be really honest, if you're somebody that's old like me, on can I get up and down the stairs? Do I have a minimum amount of strength to get up and down stairs? Do I have a minimum amount of strength to be able to get into and out of the bathtub or onto and off of the toilet, right? To walk where I need to walk, to pick up groceries, to push my shopping cart if I want to go shopping, that type of stuff. Okay. Lots of the things that we're looking to do for the careers that many of you guys want to have in physical therapy, occupational therapy, are going to actually come into this idea of physical performance and physical function. So we want to pay a little bit of attention to kind of what's going on that end. It's not all just about how big and how strong can you get, bro. So what we're going to cover that I already mentioned is if these in some ways are going to be people's goals, what are we gonna do when we resistance train that causes that actual change? Like what is the stimulus? Okay. And so when you go and you do stuff, what's going on? Pause for a moment. What's up, babe? Okay, you got to put a shirt on. Yeah, I know. You got to have clothes on, right? Okay. Ellis will be joining us momentarily, apparently. Okay, maybe not. So what's the stimulus, right? Because if we know what the stimulus is, then that's going to be one of the things that can absolutely guide when you go work out today. What do you actually need to do, right? If we understand what has to happen metabolically, what has to happen from a force perspective, from a type of contraction perspective, then that can be the real guide to, okay, today I should be doing 3 sets of 6 or 7 sets of 2 or 2 sets of 25 or whatever that's going to be, and how much weight should you be lifting, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. We'll also talk about what changes. So if we get the stimulus right, what are the things that are going to change that are going to help make us stronger? And then what are the things that are going to give us bigger muscles at the end of the day when we do all of these things. Okay. And so then we'll finish up, and we won't get to this today. We'll probably be this on Friday, is we'll get into the mechanisms of change. So, like on a cellular level, what are the things? So, if we get a stimulus, we know what's going to change. If we know we're going to end up getting hypertrophy, kind of what are the cellular level events that need to get either turned on or off that are going to drive more actin and myosin, more sarcomeres, bigger myofibrils, bigger muscle fibers, and then eventually bigger muscles, right? In that particular way. So we'll get into some of these kinds of things. Okay. So let's also now talk about kind of big picture principles that are unbelievably kind of key with everything. Okay. In some ways, these two principles, the idea of training specificity, as well as the idea of overload as it relates to kind of what is happening on the cellular level, are these kind of high level rules on if you want to understand what you should do when you train and why you should train in a certain way, this is the stuff to do. Okay. And so, if we remember, and I know you guys have seen this before, the idea of training specificity. And specificity is really, really simple. Okay. You're going to get better at doing whatever it is that you're doing. Okay. Adaptations are linked directly to the demand placed on the neuromuscular system during a particular bout of exercise. So if you're doing 3 sets of 6, guess what you're going to get better at? 3 sets of 6. Okay. And there may be some transfer of that to doing, you know, 2 sets of 2 or 7 sets of 25 or something like all of that. But there may not be. Okay. And so this guide, this idea of specificity is really, really important when we think about strength. Okay. It's really, really important when we think about function because we get stronger and we get better function through using the muscles that we've trained, through the range of motion that we've trained, right? And we get nervous system adaptations that are going to help drive all of those. So that's this idea of specificity. Okay. Whatever you're doing, that's what we're going to get better at. Okay. If you want to get better at bench pressing, don't squat. Okay. If you want to get better at squatting, don't bench press. The second kind of idea that's related in some ways to this is going to get at an idea what we call overload. Okay. And so, overload, kind of, we need to remember that overload is if it's easy, do more. Okay. If whatever you normally do, right, there's some amount of stuff that you're normally doing and applying on those muscles and on that nervous system. If you want there to be adaptations, then you need to do more. And that more can be more weight, more reps, more sets, right? And additional exercise. We can manipulate that in a lot of different ways. But the idea is that there needs to be more. And then as you start doing things, if it's easy, do more, right? Or then if it was hard and it gets easier, then make it hard again. And that's probably the one thing that that most people don't do enough of because it's hard, right? Like we don't want to do those things. Ellis, you want to show them? Ellis has picked up, she has picked up weights. She's sitting here with her 2-pound weights on the bed. Ellis is doing bench press on the bed. She's doing some dumbbell bench press. So, okay. So for all of us that are going to feel like we don't want to get a workout in today, just know that my 6-year-old is doing things. All right, kiddo. So the other thing that goes into overload that I want to mention right now, okay, is the reason that overload is so important is when you overload, what you are doing is disrupting the homeostasis in the neuromuscular system. And the disruption of homeostasis can be metabolic. It can be there's too much force, right? It's that you're driving excitation contraction coupling more than you normally do. Like it can be a whole number of those different things. But that's the idea of overload, is that the body wants to stay in a place where it is in this balance. It's in this state of homeostasis. That's good. It likes to be there. Well, if we want it to adapt, if we want it to change, we need to do things and throw it out of homeostasis. And then the response to being thrown out of homeostasis is to change something so that the next time you do that exact same workout or that exact same stimulus, you throw the system out of homeostasis less. Okay. The body wants to preserve homeostasis at all costs, right? That is this overall evolutionary adaptive kind of thing. So if we can keep those principles in mind, that we need to overload and disrupt homeostasis to drive those adaptations, and that those adaptations will be very, very specific to whatever muscle group, whatever metabolic system, whatever we were doing that disrupted homeostasis, then those are our big high level guiding principles about all kinds of training. And if you keep those things in mind, you can critically evaluate every training program from a resistance standpoint, from an aerobic standpoint, from whatever it is, if you come back to those two
I
things.
gotta apologize. Oh no, great. That's okay. I'm on live. Thanks.
And so if somebody says this workout will do XYZ, then you got to figure out, is it disrupting the homeostasis? Is it specific enough to actually evoke those particular adaptations? Okay. So I've put all of what I just told you guys together into sort of a flow chart. I love a good flow chart, but I call this the acute change to chronic adaptation paradigm. And so think about this in relation to what Ellis was just doing. She, like every good bro, bonked herself in the mouth with a with a dumbbell. You do an exercise and that disrupts homeostasis. That one exercise, you get these acute changes in homeostasis, right? There's mechanical load, there's metabolic stress, there's hormones that are released, there's neurotransmitters that are released, right? All of those things are happening to let you exercise. That disrupts homeostasis, and that is the stimulus. That disruption, that stimulus drives some adaptation that if you do this over and over and over again, eventually you get enough stimulus consistently enough that you get an adaptation, and that leads to this chronic change. Bigger muscles, increase in strength, changes in the metabolic system, something like that. And that lets you achieve your training goal. Okay. And so we will get into probably a little bit on Friday that the best way I think to approach this is to start actually on the end. Start with your training goal. If you know what you want to achieve, then you can work yourself backwards to figure out what are the chronic changes that I need to make that happen. What is the stimulus then that I need to disrupt homeostasis to achieve those things? And then what does that need to then look like that I should be doing on a particular day? Okay, so if you know your goal, you can work yourself backwards in figuring these things out. And we'll put this into practice. We'll give you guys a take-home assignment. We'll ask you guys to find a program and do some things. Um, and then we'll go from there. Okay. All right. So I talked about progressive overload a little bit, and I mentioned briefly, right, this idea that we can overload by by sort of changing different parts of your training protocol. Okay. And so we're gonna get into a little bit later on in the class. I want to introduce these now. Is these are kind of the five, to me, kind of the five big components of any resistance training program that we have some ability and capacity to manipulate if we want to achieve this level of overload, or if we want to sort of have some kind of specific adaptation based upon what your goal is. Okay. We've got the choice of exercise. So what are you doing, right? What muscle group are we targeting? Are we doing it with dumbbells? Are we doing it with barbells? Are we doing it with body weight? Like, so what are we doing? The weight that we used. And so with resistance training, we're going to talk about intensity. And generally, as it relates to resistance training, intensity denotes, right, how much weight are you lifting? Very, very often, that weight or that intensity is prescribed as a percentage of your maximal strength. Okay.
Daddy,
Yes,
Daddy,
Ellis.
get the rest.
Okay. Um, what are we doing? What are we doing there? Okay. You have sets and repetitions that we're doing. Okay. So 1 set, 2 sets, 4 sets, 12 sets, whatever that is. How many reps are we doing? Very often, the amount of repetitions that we do are going to be inversely related to the intensity. So if you're at a higher intensity, you're lifting more weight, you're lifting closer to your max. By definition, then the number of reps you can do are going to be less. If you're at a lower percentage of your max, then you can theoretically do more reps. Okay. Rest periods are a thing that you can manipulate. You can rest longer or shorter. That's going to play some role in the metabolic stress. It's also going to play some role in recovery of fatigue in the neuromuscular system. So that's a thing we can manipulate. And then the order of exercises that we perform is also going to be a thing that we're going to want to do. Okay. And so if any of you guys want to try out some different things, go do a bunch of tricep exercises and then go bench press and tell me what that feels like. Or go do some curls and things, and then try to go row or something where you're going to use your back muscles and those things. Okay. So we'll talk a little bit about that later on. Okay. So quickly, as we're going to, because this is going to come up, I want to also provide a couple of definitions as it relates to kind of variables and ideas with resistance training. Okay. I know you guys have seen these before, but I want to remind you of them because we're going to talk about sort of specific training adaptations for each ones of these. Okay. The first is the idea of muscular strength. So in general, when we talk about strength, we mean the maximum force that a muscle or a muscle group can generate. Okay. Generally, with resistance training, we're referring to maximal strength as the one repetition maximum. The most weight you can lift through a concentric range of motion with good form at a particular joint. Okay. So the most weight that I can curl, or the most weight that I can squat one time. I can do one, I cannot do a second. Okay. That's a 1 rep max. Now, I'll show you guys a little bit of data. We know some things that we also will talk about muscular strength as it relates to maximal isometric force. So I think in health and fitness, you guys did the grip strength test, the isometric grip strength. And so that is a way that we can sometimes also check force. Okay. You could do it with grip strength. You can theoretically do it with any joint, but that's going to tell us something's a little bit different than what 1 rep max is. The idea of muscular endurance is how many repeated contractions can you perform with some submaximal load. Usually, though, muscular endurance is going to be how many repetitions above 15 can you do. If you want to do things as it relates to endurance, we usually talk about 15 repetitions. Thereabouts, somewhere, 15, 16, more than 12 for sure, but usually it's defined as that. Okay. When we do strength training, we can typically do what we would call sort of heavy strength training, where the resistance is relatively close to your maximum, right? 4, 5, 6, maybe 10 reps, right? Things that are going to range somewhere between 90 to about 60% of your maximal strength, right? That typically is going to result in increases in maximal strength and muscle size. The lower resistance training, so things where you're doing 35, 40 reps like that, often stuff that has low weight or things that have body weight, are going to get increases in endurance and likely some increases in size if they're performed until failure, but they're not going to be nearly as good at increasing maximal strength. So depending upon what our specific goal is, we may want to change kind of what we're doing there. Okay. So we'll just start with the big picture stuff. I asked you guys this, I think it was last week on last Wednesday when we were starting resistance training. But what does the research tell us very, very generally about how strong can you get? Okay. And so we know that the vast majority of people over a 3 to 6 month resistance training program can increase their 1 rep max strength somewhere between about 25 and 100%. And I'll show you guys the data that we derive this from and why I think those data are really powerful and from a really kind of well done study. And there's going to be some people that get almost no strength increase. There's going to be some that are going to be well above 100%. Okay. But let's just say, for example, you can lift 100 pounds. The vast majority of you over a 3 to 6 month period could probably increase your strength to 125 to maybe 200 pounds if you start off lifting at 100. Okay. We tend to see greater increases in strength when we measure it with a 1 rep max than we do if we measure it with an isometric contraction. And this is mostly due to the fact that when we train using dynamic contractions, right? If you are bench pressing and then we test your maximal strength by asking you to bench press, that's very similar to what you've been doing. And so you see greater strength gains there. If you trained isometrically, you would see greater strength gains isometrically. So that's how that goes. Interesting facts, okay? Things to keep in mind to impress your friends and your parents and your grandparents and everybody else. Strength gains are relatively similar between men and women and old and young people. And I don't mean old like me. I'm talking up into people in kind of their mid to late 70s. Once you get into your 80s, then some stuff begins to happen and things get to be a little bit impaired. Okay. But if we normalize everything relative to where you start, okay, men and women have a relatively equal capacity to increase strength. We, weirdly enough, did not figure the math on this out until the early 1990s. We thought for 70 years as a field that men could increase their strength more than women because if a man started off lifting 100 pounds and got 20% stronger and now could lift 120, and a woman started at 50 pounds and went up the same 20% and went up to 60 pounds, we thought, well, he went up 20, she went up 10, so obviously he's got a greater capacity to increase strength. And so um, the single biggest thing that's going to play a role in how much strength you can increase is genetics and how strong are you when you start? How familiar with the lift are you when you start? People that have not been doing a particular lift or have not been resistance training generally will see greater increases initially than people that have already been doing or have a history of doing things. It's just a familiarity issue. Okay. That's the big thing. There is some genetics, or there are some genetics that are going to play a role, but a lot of it is where are you starting? Okay. When we get stronger, and we're going to dig into each one of these things in quite a bit of depth, you're going to get stronger for two reasons. Okay. The first is a group of changes that we call neural adaptations. The ability of the motor cortex to tell motor neurons to fire, and for those motor neurons to send action potentials down across the neuromuscular junction to get those muscle fibers to initiate excitation contraction coupling and get cross bridges is going to get better. Okay. If you're not used to doing a certain lift or a certain activity, this is going to be one of the big ways that you're going to get stronger, and you're going to get stronger really fast. Okay. The other adaptation that takes a little bit longer is what we call a contractile protein adaptation. And this is muscle size. This is over, say, a 6 to 8 week period, and it takes a while. okay? And you've got to be consistent with what you're doing. You are going to drive your muscles to make more actin and myosin, incorporate that into sarcomeres. You're going to get bigger sarcomeres. You're going to therefore get bigger myofibrils, which means you're going to get bigger muscle fibers, which means you're going to have bigger whole muscles. More actin and myosin means more cross bridges, which means more force. Okay. And so there's a reason, right, that Ty and I harped on cognition to contraction and the role of the cross bridge cycle and all of those things, the role of muscle size and recruitment and firing rate on controlling force production so much in the previous unit, is because those are the places where we're going to see these adaptations to resistance training. And if you don't understand what that signaling pathway is, what talks to what, how and why having more cross bridges gets us more force, then understanding the adaptations that are going to take place is going to be a lot more difficult. Okay. So that's why we've done some of the things that we've done. Okay. So I'm going to show you these data. You're not going to be responsible for memorizing them. You're not going to be responsible for, recreating them in any way. But I think it's really, really important to try to illustrate to all of you all why when you read a textbook and the textbook says, or my slide says, the vast majority of people have a capacity to get between 25 and 100% stronger, that those numbers have come from somewhere. There is a wealth of scientific literature that is informing us that that's what that is. It's not just that we went to the gym and we asked some people, hey, how much stronger have you gotten, or whatever else. Okay. And so these are data from a study published in the early 2000s. And as far as I am aware, this is the largest sample size for any resistance training, kind of comprehensive resistance training study that has ever been published. Okay. And so there was almost 600 participants in the study, and they did single arm curls. Okay. And they exercised 3 days a week for 12 weeks. Their first 4 weeks, they did 3 sets of 12 with the weight they could lift only 12 times, but not 13. In the second month, they did 3 sets of 8, so a little heavier weight with their 8 RM, so the weight they could lift 8 times but not 9. And then in the final few weeks, they did 3 sets of 6. Okay. What you guys see over here on the left is a thing that we call a histogram. So for any of you guys that have had a class in statistics or a class maybe in research methods, I know some of you guys have had a little bit of exposure to those. Some folks take stats in the psych department. Some of you guys may or may not be in Grant's our new applied research methods class, but a histogram, what we are showing over here, the x-axis is showing the percent increase in strength. So the 1 rep max gain across these 585 participants. The y-axis is showing the percentage, the number of these nearly 600 people that were experiencing this much sort of increase. And so what they have done, every bar represents a sort of a like 20 to 25%, 25 to 30% represents a 5 percentage point range. Okay. And what we see with this is the men are in black, the women are in sort of the white bars. And it's just showing you the distribution of how many people were like down here. They actually got weaker. They did 12 weeks of resistance training and they got weaker. And then how many got sort of, here's 20%, here's about 30%, and it's starting to come down, right? So when we look at it this way, we've got some people that were out here that were like 250%. The vast majority of all of these people are going to fall somewhere between about 15% and about 100% in their strength increases. Okay. There's lots of variability. Every individual person responds differently. Every individual person, we would call that an anecdote, has their own experience. Some people don't get stronger. Some people get really, really strong. Those are real and valid data points, but we need to see what a bunch of people do to be able to have a sense of what kind of capacity is going to be. Okay. You will note there's this great big bar out here of almost 15% of women getting 100% stronger. This is likely due to women having less history of doing curls and those things. So in 1RM, women got stronger on average than the men did. This is likely due again to sort of less history with doing curling exercise. The bottom is they did an isometric contraction with their bicep at 90 degrees of elbow flexion. And you will note, so when we do research and we measure maximal strength, we do isometric contractions. Note how this is a much, much sort of cleaner looking, we would call this a normal distribution. Everybody's in a much tighter, a much smaller range. There's these really high levels right around the middle, which represents the mean, right? There's very few outliers. Isometric data tends to be a little bit cleaner. And so their isometric strength went up to a much smaller percent than their 1 rep max strength did. They trained doing dynamic contractions, and so that's why their strength went up more there. Isometric strength measures tend to be more reflective of changes in muscle size than they do in when you're training with dynamic contractions than a 1 rep max. So we'll come back to how much bigger these people's muscles got probably on Friday. Okay. So you guys with me so far on all of that? Have I put everybody to sleep? Do we need to let me pull up everybody on the screen? No, some of y'all still have your cameras on. That's awesome. That's very nice. We make everybody get up and do a couple of squats. Okay. So think about what your workout's going to be today. All right. So within this increase in strength that we're seeing here, and then within what we're seeing here, what is it that's actually changing? Okay. So the first thing that we're going to start talking about are what we call neural adaptations. Neural adaptations are changes in how the motor cortex is able to signal and tell, right, your motor neurons and therefore your motor units and your muscle fibers to turn on and generate force. Okay. Neural adaptations are sometimes called learning effects. You've learned, anybody talks about muscle memory and those kinds of things, which I have a former colleague that used to really hate that term. Doesn't bother me so much. He'd get real bad out of shape to be like, your muscles don't have a brain and they don't have a memory. And I guess on some levels he was right, but I mean, your brain is just a collection of neurons. And so all memory is just neurons. All memory is just action potentials in certain places, which is kind of a wild and crazy thought. But these are learning effects, okay? And so the general thing that happens, the biggest thing that happens is most of us, right, are unable to make all of the motor neurons that go to a given muscle or muscle group fire under kind of normal circumstances if we're not accustomed to doing that particular exercise. Okay. If you're not used to squatting, then if we ask you to squat and lift as much weight as you can when you squat, you may only be able to recruit 75 or 80% of the motor neurons that are going to lead to your quads, your glutes, right? And the muscles that you're using to do all of that. Somebody that's really good and really accustomed to squatting may be able to recruit somewhere between 95 and 100% of those. So what this is doing is neural adaptations are allowing us to reach a higher percentage of our innate capacity within our muscles. Okay. And that's why they can happen really fast and is because we already have the muscle, we already have the motor neurons. We just need to learn, if you will, how to turn them on so that we can use them. Okay. So the question of what adapts in the nervous system, I'm going to put the caveat, right, that we don't fully know and understand exactly what all is going on, but we do have evidence that we have an increased ability to recruit high threshold type 2A and especially type 2X motor units. Okay. If you're unaccustomed to doing an exercise, you should generally have no trouble recruiting your type 1 motor units, but it's those last 10, 15, 20% of motor units, which tend to be the largest motor units and tend to be the fastest 2As and our 2X fibers, those are going to be the ones that you're going to get better at recruiting. Okay. And I'll show you guys a little bit of data on kind of how we might measure that and what we might know. You're also going to get an increase in something called synchronization of motor unit recruitment. And this happens in sort of two ways. The first of which I'm going to just briefly mention, and then we're going to forget about it because it's graduate level neuromuscular physiology. But you actually get better at synchronizing the action potentials going to every motor unit so that they all fire. It's sort of like one action potential to all of them, and they stack on top of each other. And it's like having multiple waves in the water where the waves are all sort of in frequency with each other. They add up. That's one way that we do it. But the real thing that I think is and that's hard to measure, but the real thing that goes on that will make sense to you guys is when we say synchronization of recruitment, what we really mean is it's synchronization of all of our agonist muscles and our synergist muscles firing at exactly the same instant in time, right? So if you're going to do a knee extension, I'm going to get all four knee extensors to fire at the same time and get maximum force out of them, right? All of the vasti and the rectus femoris. If you've got something where there are synergist muscles that are helping out, you're getting the synergist muscles to fire all at the same time. And so what this really is it's synchronizing multiple muscles firing at the same time. And you can think of this as just sort of learning how to do an activity, right? That there's a particular sequence, there's a particular order that things need to go in to execute that movement. And when we're not used to doing it, we don't do it in the optimum way. Okay. The other thing that we see that I mentioned last week is as you lift heavier and heavier things and you do so without tearing your muscles and your tendons apart, you turn down the sensitivity of your Golgi tendons. And so then the Golgi tendon will allow you to generate more force. And before it starts shutting off those muscles and activating the antagonist muscles. And then there is some evidence, although again, it's hard to measure, that you can actually increase firing frequency within the motor units that we have that are active during a particular activity. And so again, it's a difficult thing to measure, but we think there's some evidence that that's what's going on. But the big things, right, are you recruit more motor units, you recruit those high threshold units, okay? There's some synchronization across multiple muscles to help us do the motor pattern better, and you decrease the Golgi tendon. So you're getting less antagonist activation overall. The fun part of all of this is that these things occur quickly, okay? As soon as after one bout of exercise, okay? Um, I'll ask everybody sort of wave at me. Do they still do Dr. Pinku and Chris and Caitlin? Are y'all still doing the 1 rep max bench press exercise in Principles of Health and Fitness? Okay. So my guess, and you don't have to have a show of hands, is that this was my favorite day of that class, was the day that we did the bench press 1 rep max. Because there will always be people in class that have never done a bench press before, ever. Okay. Never ever done a bench press. And you could watch them do the bench press and you could watch them over like doing several repetitions of it actually get better. You could watch the neural adaptations occurring in real time, basically, as someone was doing a weird new movement and as they especially begin to figure that synchronization portion out while they were doing things. Okay. Additionally, you go and bench press today and you overload the neuromuscular system today. If you've never done an exercise before, we come back tomorrow, you'll be stronger tomorrow. Okay. You'll be stronger immediately at doing these kinds of things. Okay. Now, you take a person that has already been training for a while and they're doing things and they have less of a chance of being stronger tomorrow every time. But relatively untrained people can begin to adapt immediately. Okay. These adaptations occur well before any increase in cross sectional area. You guys will see it takes 6 to 8 weeks to get changes in muscle size, but we will see these rapid increases in strength in the first, say, 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks of training. Okay. Which is really great, but it also becomes really frustrating because after that first sort of month or two, the ability to continue to increase strength, you've already achieved most of these neural adaptations. And so that ability to continue to increase is going to decline and people will get frustrated. They're like, oh, I got really strong really fast because I was new at doing this. And then it begins to level off and people get frustrated and then they want to stop working out. Okay. And so now, then you got to go into whatever you guys are in lifestyle intervention. You got to start learning about theories of behavior change and why the psychology of all of that plays some role in how we can change things. Okay. Okay. Other things to keep in mind with neural adaptations. They're very, very specific to the exercise type. They are specific to the muscle group. They are specific to the range of motion. Okay. And in some ways, they are specific to the contraction type. So if you are doing bench press on a machine where you're doing each arm independently on that machine, you're going to get better at doing bench press with each arm working independently on a machine. Okay. That may or may not transfer particularly well to doing bench press with a barbell. Okay. It may or may not transfer completely to doing bench press with a dumbbell in each hand where each arm is working independently. Okay. It's going to be dependent upon the full range of motion. Are you doing a concentric contraction? Are you doing concentric eccentric? Right? It's all very, very, very specific to what are we doing. Whatever the motor pattern is you're practicing, that's the one that gets better. Okay. And so when you do things that are single joint exercises, that are simple, more straightforward exercises like a curl or a tricep extension, right? Or you're going to do grip strength or something, right? You're going to get better at doing that. But then when you do a more compound multiple joint exercise that involves those muscles, but also other muscles, the transfer of that from the simpler one to the more complicated one is not going to be as great. Now it works the other way. If I bench press, I may get better at doing some tricep stuff because the bench press works my triceps some. So there may be some transfer from the compound exercise to the simple more so than there is from the simple to the compound. Okay. Just things to keep in mind, right? And so this is the idea that if you have a client or you have someone, how should we train? Well, you've got to think about what do they want to get better at? What is their performance metric going to be if they're an athlete or if they're an older individual, there's somebody that's post stroke or post ACL repair or something like what is it you actually want them to do? And we need to have them doing those things. Okay. Similarly, kind of on the other end, neural adaptations are likely the only way that very advanced lifters who've kind of maxed out their ability to make their muscles bigger can get any stronger. There is a top end limit on strength in all of you, provided you don't take steroids. Okay. Your muscles can only get so big. And once you max out how big they can get, once you learn how to recruit all of the motor units that go to all of that muscle, that's it. Okay. So we'll finish off talking about a thing called the crossover effect, which I think is a really cool and interesting way to demonstrate how these adaptations in the nervous system will work. Okay. The crossover effect tells us that if I train and I do grip strength, I've got my right hand up and I do grip strength training with my right hand. Okay. It makes perfect sense that my right hand gets stronger. Okay. But the cool thing about the crossover effect is that when I train just my right hand, my left grip strength also gets better. Okay. It also gets better. And it gets about half better by about half as much, but it gets better. I did no exercise here, but it still got better. Okay. That's called the crossover effect. Train one side of the body, the other side gets better. It's mostly driven by the fact that in the motor cortex, When you work on the neural pattern for one side, some of those neurons actually have connections that cross over onto the other side of the motor cortex. And so when one side learns how to do something, that motor pattern is also sort of remembered on the other side of your brain. Also, the motor neurons, right, and the connections in the motor neurons from one side of the body are very close to the ones on the other side. And so the motor pattern tends to be very similar. Really, really fascinating stuff. If you want to do rehab with somebody that's had a stroke, somebody that's had an ACL tear, somebody that has MS, you've got a good side and a bad side of the body. If you train their good side, you can teach their bad side how to get better even before their bad side maybe is structurally sound enough to be able to do exercises and those things. So lots of really, really cool and interesting stuff that goes on there. Okay, let me see what was in the chat. Okay. Quickly, Miles. All right, so I know we are basically at our time. Miles, we'll save your question for next time. So, what are some of the physiological effects of steroids? The big thing is when you take steroids, it drives protein synthesis, so you get bigger muscles, you get more actin and myosin, and the steroids essentially counteract the genetic limit that governs how big your muscles can get. If you take steroids, you're going to get bigger, faster, and you're going to get bigger than anybody can without taking them. You can counteract your genetic limit. And so, anytime, and this is going to be a terrible thing, but anytime you tend to see people that are really, really big, they're probably taking steroids, right? They're probably taking steroids. We don't look, people cannot generally look like The Rock looks without taking steroids. He's just not going to be that big, right? That big, that lean, especially if you see what The Rock used to look like on some of those things. You just that they're you're just it's just really, really hard to get to those places without taking steroids. So, but we'll talk more about that. Okay. All right. That is all for today. Hopefully, weather permitting, I will see you guys on Friday and we will try to give tests back. We'll talk about how we're doing on the tests, and we'll go from there. Okay. All right. Well, thanks, guys. Stay warm, stay safe. If you're gonna be out and about, make sure you put the 4-wheel drive on your car or your truck or whatever, or just stay home. Okay. All right. See everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.